My name is Jae-Min Park, and I'm writing this from my car in the company parking lot during lunch break, where I eat alone every single day rather than entering the cafeteria where my white co-workers gather in social groups that never include me despite working at the same tech company for 6 years, having identical or superior technical qualifications, and speaking fluent English without significant accent. At 36, I've achieved the immigrant dream on paper. Good job, suburban house, 2 children in good schools. But my family and I exist in profound social isolation that makes every day feel like we're invisible, watching American life happen around us, but never truly participating in the casual social interactions, informal networks, parent friendships, workplace bonding, and community connections that native-born white Americans take for granted while we remain perpetual outsiders, whose cultural difference marks us as not quite belonging no matter how long we live here or how well we perform our roles. The workplace social exclusion began on my first day at TechVision 6 years ago when I joined as a senior software engineer with excellent credentials from Seoul National University, strong technical skills demonstrated through my interview performance, and eager hopes that American workplace culture will be more inclusive and merit-based than the rigid hierarchies I had experienced in Korean corporate culture. The technical onboarding went smoothly. Within weeks, I realized that the real work happened not just in meetings and at desks, but in informal social interactions during lunch, coffee breaks, happy hours, and casual conversations where relationships formed, information flowed, and alliances developed that determined who got interesting projects, mentorship, and advancement opportunities. The lunch isolation became my daily reality as I would enter the cafeteria at noon and scan for welcoming faces or empty seats at tables where I might join, only to find that white co-workers clustered in established social groups that never made space for me. Early attempts to join tables were met with polite but cool responses that made clear my presence was tolerated but not welcomed, with conversations often faltering when I sat down or continuing in ways that reference people, cultural touchpoints, and shared experiences I didn't have access to, making me feel like an intruder rather than a colleague. The cultural reference barriers became apparent as workplace conversations constantly referenced American pop culture, sports, childhood experiences, regional differences, and cultural knowledge that I simply didn't despite my English fluency and years in America. When co-workers bonded over shared memories of Nickelodeon shows, college football rivalries, regional food preferences, or political figures from their youth, I had no framework for participating in conversations that seemed trivial, but actually served crucial social bonding functions that determined workplace relationships and opportunities. The happy hour exclusions were particularly painful as my team regularly organized after-work gatherings at local bars that I learned about only when overhearing colleagues making plans or seeing photos posted on social media after the events. Early in my employment, I directly asked about joining these gatherings and was told it's just informal, not really organized. People just show up in ways that made clear that while the events weren't officially exclusive, the social networks that generated them did include me, and my presence wouldn't be welcomed or comfortable for anyone. The promotion bypass happened 3 years into my employment when a position for team lead opened, and I applied despite my manager's lukewarm response to my interest. My technical qualifications exceeded the requirements, and my performance reviews have been consistently excellent. But during the interview process, the hiring committee expressed concerns about my cultural fit and communication style despite my fluent English and effective technical communication. The position went to a white colleague with less experience and weaker technical skills, but who was part of the social networks through shared happy hour attendance, casual conversation participation, and the indefinable fit that always seemed to favor people who looked and acted like the existing leadership. The feedback devastation came when I asked my manager what I could do to improve my candidacy for future leadership opportunities, and he gave vague advice about working on presence and building relationships without any concrete guidance about what those things meant or how I could develop them. The subtext was clear. The problem wasn't my technical competence or even my English proficiency, but something about my cultural background, my communication patterns, my social style, and my difference from the white American norm that made decision makers uncomfortable with promoting me to leadership despite my qualifications. The children's isolation paralleled my workplace exclusion as my 8-year-old daughter Minji and 6-year-old son Sunho attended the local public elementary school in our suburban neighborhood, where they were among the few Asian students and struggled to develop friendships with white classmates who seemed to effortlessly bond with each other while treating my children as permanent outsiders. Min Ji would come home in tears reporting that classmates didn't include her in playground games, didn't invite her to birthday parties, and formed social groups that excluded her despite her friendly attempts to participate. The playdate void was particularly visible as white parents in our neighborhood regularly organized playdates for their children, with kids constantly visiting each other's homes after school and on weekends, while my children were never invited despite Min Ji's repeated requests to have friends over and my wife's attempts to connect with other parents at school pickup. The few times we initiated playdate invitations to Min Ji's classmates, parents made excuses or agreed but never reciprocated, making clear that our family wasn't part of the social networks that organized children's social lives outside school. The parent social network exclusion extended beyond playdates to the broader parent community at our children's school, where my wife Soo-Jin, who stayed home to care for our children while working on finishing her graduate degree online, found herself completely excluded from the informal parent networks that communicated through text groups, organized volunteer activities, and created the social infrastructure of the school community. Despite her perfect English, she had completed her undergraduate degree at UCLA and friendly attempt to connect with other mothers. She remained on the periphery of a parent community that seemed to effortlessly include white mothers while keeping her at arm's length. The cultural event awkwardness happened during school events like the winter concert, spring fair, and parent-teacher organization meetings where we would attend dutifully but stand uncomfortably on the margins while white. Parents clustered in social groups, chatting familiarly with teachers they knew from years of school involvement, and with each other from neighborhood connections, playdates, and other social interactions that had generated relationships we had no access to despite living in the same neighborhood and attending the same school. The neighborhood isolation completed our family social disconnection as we lived on a street with other families who had children similar ages to ours, but who never included us in a casual neighborhood socializing. The impromptu gatherings in front yards, the block parties we learned about only when seeing them occur, the email chains about neighborhood concerns that we weren't included in, and the general sense that there was a community happening around us that we couldn't penetrate. Despite 5 years of living on the same street, the wife's depression deepened as Soo-Jin's isolation as a stay-at-home mother with no local social network and limited connection to the Korean community. We lived in a predominantly white suburb rather than near Korean ethnic enclaves, created profound loneliness that affected her mental health and our marriage. She had sacrificed her career in Korea to immigrate with me, had struggled to adapt to American culture, had put her own education on hold to care for our children, and now found herself spending days alone while I worked and the children attended school with no friends to call, no social activities to participate in, and no sense of belonging in the community we lived in. The mental health crisis emerged when Soo-Jin admitted she was having suicidal thoughts related to her isolation and sensed that we had made a terrible mistake immigrating to America, where we would never truly belong or be accepted regardless of our qualifications, English proficiency, or efforts to integrate. The realization that my wife's mental health had deteriorated to crisis level while I had been focused on my own workplace struggles forced recognition that our entire family was suffering from systematic social exclusion that was destroying our well-being and making us question whether the material comfort we had achieved was worth the profound loneliness and disconnection we experienced daily. The family therapy began with Dr. Jennifer Kim, a Korean-American psychologist who specialized in working with immigrant families dealing with acculturation stress, and understood that our experience of social isolation wasn't individual failure or lack of effort, but reflected systematic patterns of social exclusion in predominantly white spaces that created belonging only for those who matched narrow cultural norms, while marginalizing everyone else regardless of qualifications or integration efforts. Social exclusion in predominantly white spaces operates through informal gatekeeping that's invisible to people who are included, but creates insurmountable barriers for cultural outsiders. Dr. Kim explained during one of our family sessions. The casual conversations, cultural references, social networks, and informal bonding that happen in workplaces, schools, and neighborhoods aren't just nice social features. They're the actual mechanisms through which opportunities are distributed, information flows, and belonging is created. When you're systematically excluded from these informal spaces because of cultural difference that makes insiders uncomfortable, or because you don't share the unspoken cultural knowledge that facilitates bonding, you're cut off from the social capital that determines success regardless of your technical qualifications or language proficiency. She helped us understand that our family's isolation reflected not personal inadequacy, but the ways that predominantly white American institutions create belonging through cultural homogeneity that excludes difference, and that our children's social struggles weren't evidence that they were socially awkward, but that they were experiencing the same systematic exclusion that we faced as adults. The validation that our experiences were real and reflected structural problems rather than our failures was important for countering the internalized shame we had developed about our inability to achieve social belonging despite our efforts. The coping strategies work involved accepting that we might never achieve full social integration in our predominantly white suburb and workplace, while also developing specific approaches to reduce isolation and protect our mental health. This included deliberately seeking out other Korean American families, even if it required traveling to different neighborhoods, joining Korean American community organizations, and creating alternative sources of social connection and cultural belonging rather than continuing to beat ourselves against the closed doors of white-dominated spaces. The Korean American community connection began when we started attending a Korean American church 45 minutes from our home, where we finally experienced the immediate social inclusion and effortless belonging that had been denied us in our predominantly white neighborhood and workplace. Within weeks of attending, we had developed friendships with other Korean American families facing similar social exclusion in their own predominantly white contexts. Our children had Korean American friends who eagerly invited them to playdates, and Soo-Jin had a social network of other Korean American mothers she could call and meet with for coffee and conversation. The cultural identity embrace that developed through our community connections helped us stop trying to perform whiteness or minimize our Korean identity to gain acceptance in white-dominated spaces, and instead celebrate our cultural heritage while acknowledging that we would likely always be outsiders in predominantly white American context regardless of our integration efforts. This reframing helped reduce the shame and self-blame we had internalized about our social exclusion, and helped our children develop pride in their Korean American identity, rather than viewing their difference as deficit. The workplace strategy shift involved accepting that I might never advance the leadership at TechVision given the cultural barriers, and beginning to explore opportunities at companies with more diverse leadership and explicit commitments to inclusion rather than just continuing to excel technically while being passed over for advancement due to cultural fit concerns. The recognition that merit alone wouldn't overcome social exclusion in my current workplace was painful, but also liberating, because it redirected my energy from trying to change myself to fit an unwelcoming environment toward finding environments that might value my contributions despite cultural difference. The children's school advocacy began when we started openly discussing with school administrators the patterns of social exclusion our children experienced, and advocating for programming that would address cultural integration beyond just celebrating diversity during special events. We pushed for explicit social inclusion training for students, structure activities that created opportunities for cross-cultural friendships, and teacher awareness about how informal social networks excluded minority students even in schools that prided themselves on diversity. The neighborhood approach changed as we stopped trying to force integration with white neighbors who had shown no interest in including us, and instead started hosting gatherings specifically for the few other minority families in our area who we discovered were experiencing similar isolation. These gatherings created alternative community and reduced the sense that we were the only ones experiencing social exclusion, while also creating playdate opportunities for our children with other minority kids who understood what it felt like to be outsiders. The advocacy work that emerged from our experience includes speaking about workplace cultural fit bias and how informal social networks create exclusion that limits opportunities regardless of qualifications, and pushing companies to recognize that creating inclusive workplaces requires more than hiring diverse employees. It requires actively disrupting the informal social networks and cultural homogeneity that create belonging only for dominant groups while excluding everyone else. The research engagement with organizational psychologists studying workplace belonging and exclusion helps document how informal social interactions determine opportunities and how cultural outsiders experience systematic disadvantage in predominantly white workplaces, even when they have excellent technical qualifications and language proficiency. The The research validates that our experiences weren't unique or evidence of personal failure, but reflected well-documented patterns of social exclusion. The mentorship relationships I've developed focus on helping other Asian American professionals understand that technical excellence alone won't overcome cultural barriers to advancement, that social exclusion in predominantly white workplaces is systematic rather than individual, and that sometimes the best strategy is finding more inclusive environments rather than continuing to try to gain acceptance in spaces that are fundamentally unwelcoming regardless of qualification or effort. Today, I continue working at TechVision while actively job searching at companies with more diverse leadership and stronger inclusion practices, accepting that my technical contributions will likely never be recognized with advancement opportunities given the cultural barriers I face. My family has achieved some social connection through our Korean American community, while accepting that we'll likely never feel fully included in our predominantly white neighborhood or children's school. The children's social lives have improved significantly through friendships with Korean American peers, reducing their isolation while also creating complicated questions about cultural identity, code switching, and navigating between Korean American spaces where they belong and predominantly white school spaces where they remain outsiders. We're helping them develop bicultural competence while also validating their experiences of exclusion rather than blaming them for social struggles that reflect systematic barriers. Key resources and solutions that made the difference. Family therapy with culturally competent providers who understand acculturation stress and systematic social exclusion helps process isolation and develop coping strategies. Mental health crisis intervention for depression and suicidal ideation related to profound isolation provides immediate support and ongoing treatment. Cultural community organizations provide alternative sources of belonging and social connection when mainstream spaces remain exclusive. Workplace diversity advocacy pushes companies to address cultural fit, bias, and informal social networks that exclude despite hiring diverse employees. School inclusion programming explicitly addresses social exclusion and creates structured opportunities for cross-cultural friendship development. Organizational psychology research on workplace belonging documents systematic patterns of exclusion and supports advocacy for structural changes. Mentorship from people who have navigated similar exclusion provides practical strategies and validation that experiences reflect structural problems. Peer support from other minority families facing similar isolation reduces sense of individual failure and creates community. Today, when diversity advocates suggest that hiring diverse employees solves inclusion problems, I explain that my family is invisible despite my qualifications, that technical excellence and language proficiency can't overcome systematic social exclusion, and that creating genuine inclusion requires disrupting the informal social networks and cultural homogeneity that create belonging only for dominant groups, while leaving everyone else in profound isolation that destroys mental health and limits opportunities. We're qualified, accomplished, and fluent, but we're invisible in spaces designed for cultural sameness that treats difference as deficit regardless of merit.